The universe had a new name for silence peace. 80 years had passed since the architect's anthem had quieted the screams of a dying Earth. 80 years since humanity had been gifted the great tranquility. The war, a brief and brutal affair of physics and futility, was a thing of museum hollows and redacted archives. Earth itself was the grandest of these museums, encased in a shimmering orbital shroud, a planet-sized monument to a species deemed too beautifully chaotic to exist and too historically significant to erase. What remained of its people were scattered across the Empire's gleaming city worlds, a docile and productive servant class. Every human child was born with a calm lock, a whisper of biotechnology nestled at the base of the skull that filtered the storm of the soul. It didn't remove emotion. The architects were artists, not butchers. It simply smoothed the sharp edges. Rage became mild irritation. Soul-crushing grief became a fleeting melancholy. Ecstatic joy became a pleasant contentment. Humanity had been perfected, its volatile heart replaced with the steady, metronomic pulse of a machine. Kalen, or Registry Nor K7R4 as the Imperial Census knew him, was a curator of this quiet. He was an archivist on Cygnus X1, a world-spanning metropolis of crystalline spires and rivers of light, and his domain was the Mausoleum of Soul, the grand repository of all that remained of pre-conquest human history. His days were spent in the hushed, climate-controlled twilight of the data vaults, his fingers dancing over light tables as he sifted through the digital ghosts of his ancestors. He redacted poems that spoke too passionately of freedom, flagged symphonies whose crescendos were deemed emotionally excessive, and categorized the final, frantic transmissions of Earth's last defenders as societal collapse data. He did his job with the passionless efficiency of all his kin, the hollow ache in his chest, a familiar, ignorable companion, the ghost of a feeling he had no name for. His world cracked on a Tuesday. The artifact was a new acquisition, a deep strata data crystal unearthed from the ruins of what was once called the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. It was supposed to contain agricultural data, nothing more. But deep within the mundane records of crop rotation and genetic sequencing was a corrupted file, a parasite of memory latched onto the code. The archive's purification filters, designed to scrub emotional resonance and ideological contagions, flagged it. But Kalen, driven by a flicker of professional curiosity he mistook for diligence, bypassed the quarantine to inspect the anomaly directly. The file wasn't a record, it was a weapon, an Echo Brigade memory bomb. It didn't enter the system, it entered him. The light from the table seemed to flood his nerves, bypassing the calm lock, short-circuiting 80 years of engineered peace. It wasn't data. It was the sudden, shocking scent of pine needles after a rainstorm. A smell he had never encountered but knew with bone-deep certainty. It was the phantom taste of salt on his lips, not from food, but from tears he had never shed. It was the blinding warmth of a sun on his bare skin, the joyous, unrestrained laughter of a child playing in a field of green, the rough texture of a calloused hand holding his own. Then came the fire. It was the searing heat of a plasma scoring the sky, the gut-wrenching, soul-shattering grief of a mother watching her world burn, a pain so vast and absolute it had a weight, a physical presence that buckled his knees and stole the air from his lungs. He collapsed against the console, his body trembling with the aftershocks of 1 billion dead souls. The calm lock at the base of his skull flared with a sharp, cold sting, desperately trying to contain the flood, to dampen the inferno. It held, but something inside him had fractured. A hairline crack had formed in the dam, and an ocean of forgotten feeling was pressing against it. He managed to stumble to the daily diagnostic scanner, his hands shaking, his heart hammering with a rhythm that was both terrifying and intoxicatingly alive. He held his breath as the scanner's green light washed over him. Calm lock integrity, 9.8%. Nominal function. He had hidden it. He had hidden a crack in the foundation of his entire world. The echoes started leaking. At first, they were fleeting sensory ghosts that ambushed him in the quiet of the archives. He would be cataloging architect legal decrees and suddenly smell baking bread. He would be walking through the sterile corridors and feel the ghost of a lover's touch on his arm. He would hear snatches of music, raw and discordant and beautiful, that would vanish the moment he tried to focus on them. These were not his memories, yet they felt more real than his own placid existence. His life's work, the curation of a dead history, had become a lie. He was living in a mausoleum, and for the first time, he could smell the dust of ages, feel the chill of the tomb. His obsession shifted from his work to the corrupted file. He spent his nights in the archives, bathed in the soft glow of the light table, carefully dissecting the memory bomb. He moved it to a shielded, offline server, telling his supervisors it was a particularly virulent data worm that required manual, isolated cleansing. Under this guise, he coaxed the file's secrets out, bit by agonizing bit. It was more than a weapon of emotional warfare. It was a message, a last will and testament from the Echo Brigade. The text, when he finally decoded it from the chaotic stream of sensory data, was simple and chilling. We are not an ending. We are a seed. Wake us. Beneath the message was the key, a complex waveform, a resonant frequency hidden not in the code, but in the very structure of the recorded emotions. It was a symphony composed of a child's hope, a soldier's fury, a scientist's despair, and a poet's love. The file called it the heart cry, and the schematics hidden within its layers suggested the impossible that this frequency, if broadcast through the Empire's own comm network, wouldn't shatter the comm locks, but resonate with them. It would use the architect's own technology as a tuning fork, reintroducing the full, terrifying spectrum of human feeling to a species that had forgotten its own heart. His changed state did not go unnoticed. Alara, E4412, worked at the console across from him. She was the model of the new humanity, serene, efficient, her face a placid mask of contentment. She was beautiful in the way a perfectly cut gem was beautiful, flawless, cold, and without fire. She began to watch him. She saw the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for a data slate, the way his eyes would sometimes lose focus, staring at something in the middle distance she couldn't see. She saw him flinch once when a maintenance drone dropped a tool, a reaction far too sharp for the mild irritation a properly functioning comm lock would permit. Her suspicion was a quiet, constant pressure, a reminder that the great tranquility had vigilant protectors. She was the cage, and he was the bird who had just remembered it had wings. The cage door was an architect overseer. It arrived without warning, a silent, 7-foot pillar of swirling light and crystalline geometry that glided into the archive, its every movement accompanied by a cascade of soft, harmonic chimes that was its language. It had sensed. It chimed. A dissonance, a flaw in the data's perfect peace, a single, sour note in the endless, placid symphony of the mausoleum. The overseer began a deep-level integrity scan, its light sweeping across the data vaults, its chimes growing sharper, more inquisitive as it drew closer to Kalen's sector. He knew it was over. The shielded server wouldn't hold against a direct scan from an architect. They would find the memory bomb. They would see the crack in his soul. In that instant, a phantom memory, not his own, seized him, a soldier on a broken wall, plasma rifle empty, screaming defiance at a burning sky. It was a feeling of pure, hopeless, glorious rebellion, driven by that ghost. He acted. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He opened the file, his fingers flying across the console, isolating not the whole chaotic storm of the memory bomb, but only the key, the pure, resonant frequency of the heart cry. With a final, trembling keystroke, he broadcast it, not out into the city, not across the planet, but inward, a subliminal whisper through the archive's internal comm system. He braced for the shriek of alarms, the crushing grip of security drones, the silent, final hum of an architect's disciplinary weapon. But what came was a silence more profound than any he had ever known. The overseer froze mid-glide. Its harmonious chimes stuttered, faltered, and died, replaced by a low, discordant hum of confusion. Across the vast, cavernous hall, the quiet, rhythmic tapping of hundreds of archivists on their consoles ceased as one. Near the central pillar, a woman's hand went limp, her data slate clattering to the polished floor. She didn't react to the sound, but slowly raised a hand to her own cheek, her fingers coming away wet. A tear. An old man near the western vault suddenly gasped, clutching his chest, his eyes wide not with pain, but with a look of thunderstruck revelation, as if a phantom limb had just regained feeling. And Alara. Alara turned and looked directly at him. Her placid mask was shattered, her mouth was slightly agape, her brows furrowed in a complex expression of utter confusion, abject terror, and something else. Something that looked almost like wonder. The broadcast was tiny, a pebble tossed into an ocean, but the ripples were spreading. The key worked. The seed could be planted. Kalen, the quiet archivist, the curator of the dead, had just taught the living how to feel again, and the architect, the being of pure, perfect logic floating before him, was trapped in a feedback loop, trying to calculate the incalculable, trying to quantify the sudden, silent, overwhelming wave of human sorrow that had just washed over its perfect, peaceful world. Its crystalline form began to vibrate, emitting a high-pitched whine of panic and disbelief, a sound that promised that the silence was well and truly broken. The high-pitched whine of the architect's crisis calculation sharpened until it was a physical needle in the brain, a sound of pure logic tearing itself apart. Kalen knew this stasis wouldn't last. A machine that encounters a paradox it cannot solve has only two options: shut down or erase the paradox. The architects had not built an empire by shutting down. He moved, his limbs feeling both heavy with newfound dread and light with a terrifying, electric purpose. His first thought was for the seed, the data crystal from Svalbard. He ejected it from the console, its crystalline facets feeling warm in his trembling hand, a vessel of impossible memory. As he turned, he met Alara's gaze across the sea of frozen figures. The terror in her eyes was a raw, naked thing, something no calm lock was ever meant to permit. But beneath it was a flicker of something else, a frantic, desperate curiosity. Her world had been a flat, gray line, and he had just introduced a vertical axis of infinite height and depth. Her mouth opened, forming a word, a question, but no sound came out. Her own body was a foreign country, its language a torrent of sensation she could not decipher. A new sound broke the spell, not the architect's whine, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated up from the floor. Red light, the color of blood and authority, began to bleed from the edges of the vaulted ceiling. Containment fields, a quarantine. The architect had made its choice. The whining ceased. The pillar of light that was the overseer pulsed once, a violent, angry crimson, and its chimes returned, no longer melodic, but staccato and sharp. Like shards of falling glass, it was issuing commands. Cognitive contagion detected. Sector 7 sealed. Initiate sentience purity protocol. Isolate source anomaly. The last command was directed at him. He saw it not as text, but as a wave of pure, logical intent that washed over him, cold and absolute. Security drones, sleek. Silver discs that had patrolled the archives with benign indifference for decades, detached from their ceiling alcoves, their single blue optical sensors now glowing a predatory red. They began to move, not towards the panicked, confused archivists, but in a tightening perimeter around him. Elara took a half step back, her hand flying to the calm lock at the base of her neck, as if to physically hold her placid world together. "What did you do?" she finally whispered, the words ragged, torn from her throat. It was the first question she had ever asked that wasn't a request for data. "I reminded them," Kalen said, his voice a low rasp. He held up the data crystal. "This is what they took from us. The reason for this quiet." He didn't have time to explain. To preach a gospel he barely understood himself. He had to run. His archivist's mind, a tool honed for finding patterns in dead data, now raced to find a pattern for survival. The Mausoleum of Soul was ancient, a structure built upon the foundations of Cygnus X1's first colonial nexus. The official schematics were a lie of omission, streamlined and simplified over the centuries. But he had seen the originals, the unredacted blueprints buried deep in the most secure vaults. He knew of the old ways, the forgotten paths. He sprinted, not for the sealed main entrance, but for a maintenance alcove hidden behind a holographic panel depicting the architect's arrival in the Sol system. The drones swiveled, their movements unnaturally fast, and fired. Beams of coherent light, designed to painlessly deactivate malfunctioning systems, struck the floor around him, leaving scorch marks that smelled of ozone and finality. He slammed his hand against the panel, the hologram dissolving to reveal a rusted metal plate. A manual release. He yanked it open. The screech of protesting metal, a glorious, ugly sound in the sterile hall, and plunged into the darkness beyond. He was in the guts of the building, a labyrinth of conduits and structural supports that smelled of dust and decay, the true scent of history. Above him, he could hear the thud of the drones searching, their scanners sweeping through the walls. He was a ghost in their machine now. He ran, guided by the phantom maps in his head, his lungs burning with a fire that felt like life. The heart cries effects, he realized, were not contained. The brief, localized broadcast had acted like a stone dropped in a pond, and the building's own energy and data conduits were carrying the ripples. As he passed a ventilation shaft, he heard it a woman weeping. Not the quiet, dignified sorrow the calm lock permitted, but a raw, ugly, soul-deep sob of utter despair. Further on, he heard a man laughing, a wild, unhinged peal of pure, manic joy. The contagion was spreading. The emotional plague was loose. He emerged into a lower-level transit hub. The scene was one of quiet. Surreal chaos. Transport pods hung motionless on their magnetic tracks. People stood frozen in the middle of walkways, staring at their own hands as if they were alien objects. A man in an Imperial Administrator's uniform was on his knees, carefully, tenderly tracing the grout lines on the floor, a look of profound, childlike wonder on his face. No one was rioting. No one was screaming. They didn't know how. They were infants drowning in an ocean of feeling, each lost in their own private hurricane. Kalen knew this phase of confusion was his only cover. Soon, the Empire's control systems would adapt. Enforcers, humanoid constructs with calm locks far more robust than those of civilians, would be deployed. They would not be confused. They would be efficient. He needed a destination, a purpose beyond simple flight. Wake us. The message from the Echo Brigade. It was a command, not a plea. But where were they? He ducked behind a dormant information kiosk, the data crystal clutched to his chest. He needed information, and he was in the heart of the galaxy's greatest library. He pressed his palm to the kiosk's interface, intending to access the public network, but a jolt of ancestral memory, the ghost of a long-dead hacker, guided his fingers. He didn't request access, he forced it, bypassing security protocols with a fluency that wasn't his own. He searched, not for the Echo Brigade, a term that would be scrubbed from every public record, but for its shadow. He cross-referenced pre-conquest architectural styles, casualty reports from the final battle for Earth, and decommissioned Imperial infrastructure projects. He was looking for a deliberate blank space, a place the Empire wanted forgotten, and he found it. Sector 9, the Old Industrial Sprawl. Officially, it had been dismantled and recycled 2 generations ago after a series of catastrophic reactor failures. The area was now listed on all maps as the Great Signian Void, a restricted, irradiated wasteland, but the archive contained a single, anomalous file Kalen had once dismissed as a clerical error, a pre-Imperial power grid schematic showing a massive, shielded energy conduit running directly into the heart of the supposedly empty sector, a conduit that was still drawing a trickle of power from the city grid. It was a lie. Sector 9 hadn't been destroyed. It had been buried. He had his destination. He cut the connection and was about to move when a shadow fell over him. He looked up into Ilara's face. She had followed him. Her expression was no longer one of pure terror. It was a fractured mosaic of anger, fear, and a desperate and hungry need for answers. In her hand, she held a small silver object, a personal alert beacon. One touch, and his location would be broadcast to every enforcer unit in the city. "They will dissect you," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "They will peel back your mind layer by layer to find out how you broke." "They broke us first," Kalen countered, his voice low and urgent. "They hollowed us out, Ilara. They turned us into ghosts and told us it was peace. Don't you feel it? The weight of it." He gestured to the chaotic tableau of the transit hub. "This is not madness. This is birth. It's messy and it hurts, but it's real." She flinched, a wave of some new, unnameable emotion washing over her face. He saw her struggle, the lifelong conditioning warring with the primal scream of the heart cry in her soul. She was the fulcrum upon which his fate, and perhaps everything, now rested. He decided to gamble. He reached out, not to grab the beacon, but to gently touch the back of her hand with the data crystal. He pushed a flicker of the file's raw data into her. A single, curated memory, the feeling of a newborn baby's hand closing around a father's finger. Absolute, unconditional love. Ilara gasped, her eyes widening as the foreign, overwhelming warmth flooded her senses. The alert beacon slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the floor. She stared at him, her defenses shattered, her entire existence called into question by a single, impossible feeling. "Where are you going?" she whispered. The question, not an accusation, but a plea. "To find the people who sent this," he said, nodding towards the crystal, "to see if there's an answer to the pain, to see if there's a way to survive the beauty." He scooped up the beacon and held it out to her. "You can still use it, or you can come with me." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and ran towards the service tunnels that led to the city's forgotten underbelly, leaving her standing alone in the heart of the silent, screaming chaos, the choice and the weight of a reawakened soul resting entirely in her hands. He ran, and for the first time, he didn't hear the sound of pursuit behind him. He heard only the frantic, unsteady beat of two human hearts in a world that had forgotten the rhythm of its own. The service tunnels of Cygnus X1 were a descent into a forgotten age. The smooth, seamless polymers of the upper city gave way to rough-hewn duracrete, stained and weeping with decades of condensed humidity. The rivers of channeled light were replaced by the anemic, flickering glow of emergency strobes, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of mildew, ionized dust, and the faint, metallic tang of decay. It was the smell of a foundation, the ugly, necessary truth hidden beneath a beautiful lie. Kalen ran, Ilara a half-step behind him, her presence a silent, uncertain question at his back. He'd been shocked when she'd followed. A choice so contrary to 80 years of programmed obedience, it felt like a miracle. Her face, when he glanced back, was a canvas of raw, warring emotions. The aftershock of the memory he'd shared with her, that pure, uncomplicated love, was fading, leaving in its wake the cold, terrifying reality of their situation. She was a fugitive, an accomplice to the greatest act of sedition in the Empire's placid history. Her hands were clenched into tight fists, her knuckles white, her serene archivist's posture replaced by the coiled tension of a cornered animal. Every rumble of the city above, every drip of water in the darkness, made her flinch. She was a newborn in a world of monsters, and he had made her so. The guilt was a sharp, physical pain in his chest, another new and unwelcome sensation. They moved deeper, following the ghost of the power conduit from the schematics. The tunnels grew older, the architecture cruder. Imperial registry codes stenciled on the walls were replaced by symbols in a language he recognized from the deepest, most restricted archives, Old Terran. They were walking through the skeleton of the first human colony on this world, the one the architects had built their gleaming city upon. They passed vast, cavernous cisterns, long dry, their walls covered in faded, peeling murals depicting blue skies and green forests, impossible landscapes from a world they only knew as a shrouded monument. In one of these chambers, They found others, a small, ragged group of a dozen or so people, huddled around a single, jury-rigged glow lamp. They were lower caste maintenance workers, sanitation techs, the invisible cogs of the city's perfect machine. But their faces were not placid. They were alive with a panicked, desperate energy. They had been close enough to the mausoleum's internal comms network to receive a strong dose of the heart cry's ripple effect. Their calm locks were fractured, their souls bleeding. A large, burly man with grease-stained hands was weeping openly, his body shaking with racking sobs. A young woman was staring at the ceiling, a look of beatific wonder on her face, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. Another man was rocking back and forth, muttering to himself, his eyes wide with a terror Kalen recognized as the echo of the war. The memory bomb's most potent poison. They saw Kalen and Ilara, and fear, raw and primal, flashed in their eyes. The man who was weeping scrambled back, pointing a trembling finger. "You," he choked out. "You're from the mausoleum. This is your fault. This noise in my head. Make it stop." He lunged, his movements clumsy with rage, his face a mask of grief. Before Kalen could react, Ilara stepped in front of him. "Stop," she said, her voice shaking but firm. It was the first time she had spoken since the transit hub. The man faltered, confused by her presence, her fear, her defiance. "It's not a noise," Ilara said, the words coming slowly, as if she were tasting them for the first time. "It's us. It's what we were." Kalen stared at her, stunned. She was not just a follower. She was a convert. The seed of that single memory had taken root in the barren soil of her soul and was beginning to grow. He stepped forward, holding up the Svalbard crystal. "She's right," he said, his voice gaining a confidence he didn't feel. "The architects put us to sleep. They told us it was for our own good. But we're waking up now." He knew he couldn't offer them comfort or easy answers. He could only offer them a direction. There's a place they buried. Sector 9. I think the people who fought back are there. The ones who didn't surrender. A flicker of something ancient and powerful passed through the small group hope. It was a dangerous, volatile thing, more potent than any of the other emotions tearing through them. But it was a banner they could rally to. The weeping man, his rage subsiding into a weary sorrow, nodded slowly. "I know the way," he said, his voice thick. "My grandfather worked the old conduits before the Great Tranquility. He told me stories of the deep roads, of the void. Their journey became a pilgrimage, led by the maintenance worker, whose name was Jax. Their small band of fractured souls navigated the forgotten arteries of the city. They were the first generation of a new humanity, born in the dark, their emotions their only compass. They learned the new language of their own hearts together. They saw one of their number, a woman named Lyra, paralyzed by a grief so profound she could not move, and learned compassion. They saw another, a young man named Ren, erupt in a sudden violent rage, and learned restraint. Kalen, the keeper of the seed, became their reluctant prophet. In the quiet moments, he would share small, controlled fragments from the memory bomb, using the crystal like a key to unlock the feelings they couldn't name. He showed them the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman finishing his work, the fierce loyalty of a soldier for his squad, the bittersweet ache of nostalgia. He was teaching them the alphabet of the human soul. Elara became his counterpoint, the voice of the present. While Kalen spoke of the past, she spoke of the now. She helped them process the terrifying flood of sensation to build a vocabulary for their new reality. She, who had been the model of the old way, became the first teacher of the new. She was no longer just an archivist. She was a cartographer, mapping the wild, uncharted territory of the human heart. The deep roads eventually opened into a space that defied all logic. They stood on a precipice overlooking a vast, subterranean chasm. The Great Signian Void was not a wasteland. It was a cavern of impossible scale. So large it had its own weather system, with clouds of vapor drifting lazily beneath a ceiling that glittered with the faint, residual light of the city far, far above. And suspended in the center of that chasm, connected to the walls by a web of ancient, corroded sky bridges, was Sector 9. It was not a ruin. It was a city, a vertical, chaotic, defiant city, built downwards into the darkness. A stark contrast to the elegant, sky-piercing spires of Cygnus X1. Its lights were a scattered, haphazard collection of yellows, oranges, and reds, the warm, dirty light of combustion and jury-rigged power, not the clean, cold blue of architect technology. It was a city that lived and breathed and bled. The Hive, Jax whispered, a name from his grandfather's stories. As they stood there, a new sound reached them, carried on the damp air of the chasm music. It was a raw, defiant sound, a driving rhythm from percussive instruments and the soaring, mournful cry of a stringed instrument Kalen had only ever seen in holos. It was a song of struggle and survival, a hymn of the unbroken. But their arrival had not gone unnoticed. From the closest edge of the hive, a small, swift skiff detached itself and sped towards them across one of the bridges. It was a patchwork vessel, clearly cobbled together from scavenged parts, but it moved with a confident, predatory grace. As it drew closer, they saw the figures aboard 3 of them, clad in dark, functional gear, their faces obscured by goggles and breathing masks. They carried weapons, not the sleek, sterile energy rifles of Imperial enforcers, but projectile weapons, brutal and loud. The skiff landed a dozen yards away, and the figures disembarked, their movements fluid and economical. The one in the lead, a woman, pulled off her goggles. Her face was sharp, angular, etched with lines of weariness and resolve that seemed alien to Kalen. Her eyes, a startlingly pale gray, swept over their small group, missing nothing. They were not the eyes of a placid servant. They were the eyes of a wolf. "A Persiders," she said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp. "It wasn't a question. Look at you, freshly broken." "What's the occasion?" Kalen stepped forward, holding the Svalbard crystal in front of him like a shield. "We received a message," he said, his voice unsteady. "It said to wake you." The woman's eyes narrowed, her gaze fixing on the crystal. For a long moment, she was silent, her expression unreadable. Then, she let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. "The heart cry," she said, a note of disbelief in her voice. "After all this time, the old fools actually thought it would work." She took a step closer, her eyes boring into Kalen's. "You didn't just receive a message, archivist. You became one. You broadcast it." Her gaze flickered to the raw, untamed emotions playing across the faces of Kalen's followers. "And now you've brought a plague to my doorstep." Her hand rested on the grip of the pistol holstered at her hip. "The architects will be coming. They don't tolerate broken toys. They will sterilize this entire chasm to contain what you've started." She looked back at Kalen, her expression hardening. "You've woken us. All right. You've woken us up to the end of the world. Now tell me, Archivist, what in the hell are we supposed to do with you?" The music from the hive seemed to falter, the silence of the chasm pressing in, heavy and expectant. The last bastion of free humanity was not a welcoming sanctuary. It was a fortress, and Kalen had just led the enemy to its gates. The woman from the hive, whose name was Anya, did not kill them. Instead, she herded them onto the skiff with a weary, grim efficiency, her two companions keeping their rifles trained on the small band of refugees. The flight across the chasm was a dizzying, terrifying journey through the heart of the hive's defenses. Kalen saw automated gun turrets, half hidden in the rock face, track their progress. He saw nets of crackling energy arcing between pylons, ready to vaporize any unauthorized vessel. This was not just a city, it was a scar, hardened and fortified by 80 years of constant, undeclared war. The hive itself was a marvel of desperate, defiant engineering. It was a vertical slum and a fortress in one. A chaotic tapestry of repurposed shipping containers, scavenged structural plating, and habitats carved directly into the chasm's rock. Hydroponic farms, bathed in the sickly purple glow of grow lamps, clung to sheer cliff faces. Waterfalls of recycled waste cascaded down into the unseen depths, powering creaking, groaning turbines. It was loud, it was dirty, it was claustrophobic, and it was the most alive place Kalen had ever seen. The people of the hive, the downsiders, as Anya called them, were as raw and unforgiving as their environment. They were the descendants of the Echo Brigade and the few pockets of humanity that had resisted the Calm Lock's imposition. They were born with the full, violent, beautiful spectrum of human emotion. Their faces were not placid masks. They were maps of their lives, etched with lines of laughter and sorrow, anger and love. They stared at Kalen's group as they were marched through the crowded, narrow walkways, their expressions a mixture of pity, contempt, and a cold, hard curiosity. These were not the welcoming arms of a lost tribe. This was the suspicious glare of a pack of wolves inspecting a clutch of escaped sheep. Anya led them to what passed for the hive's command center, a reinforced cavern deep in the rock, its walls a chaotic patchwork of salvaged Imperial monitors and scavenged tech. An old man sat before the central console, his body frail, but his eyes burning with a fierce, undimmed intelligence. Wires snaked from the back of his skull into the ancient machinery. A crude, direct interface that bypassed the need for a screen. This was Silas, the elder of the hive, and its living memory, his gaze. When he turned it from his data streams to Kalen, was heavy with the weight of a history Kalen had only ever read about. So, Silas's voice rasped, not from his mouth, but from a voxcaster on the console, a voice of static and steel. The seed has finally sprouted. I had begun to think it was just another of the First Brigade's dying myths. He gestured a trembling, cybernetically enhanced hand towards Kalen. "Show me." Kalen stepped forward and placed the Svalbard crystal onto a diagnostic cradle. Silas's eyes closed, and the screens around them flickered, displaying waveforms, emotional resonance charts, and fragments of the sensory data that had shattered Kalen's world. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the machines and the elders' strained breathing. The frequency is pure. Silas's voice crackled, undegraded. To have survived 80 years in a dormant state. Remarkable. He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a profound, bone-deep weariness. You have rung the dinner bell. Archivist Kalen, the architects above. They are patient. They are logical. They will have analyzed the nature of your broadcast. They will have calculated the probability of a hidden resistance. They will not send enforcers. That would be an admission of failure. They will send an erasure fleet. They will collapse this entire sector, burying us under 1,000,000 tons of rock and steel to ensure the contagion of feeling does not spread. A cold dread, far deeper and more chilling than the panic he'd felt in the mausoleum, settled in Kalen's stomach. He had not brought liberation, he had brought a death sentence. The small group of refugees behind him seemed to shrink, the fragile hope that had carried them through the darkness now crumbling into despair. Ilara, however, stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her voice was clear and steady. You survived them for 80 years, she said. Her words directed at Silas. You hid from them. You fought them. Surely you have a defense, say a weapon. Anya let out another of her harsh, cynical laughs. A weapon, child. Look around you. This is the weapon. Survival. Enduring. Remembering. We fight them every day by simply existing. But we are a splinter in the architect's thumb. Annoying, but manageable. Your friend here has turned that splinter into a raging infection. There is no defense against the cure they will unleash. Silas's voice cut through the tension. The girl is right. The 1st Brigade did not plan for martyrdom. They planned for war. He turned his gaze to Kalen. The heart cry was not just a key to unlock your souls. It was the first part of a sequence. The frequency you broadcast. It is also a command code. It was meant to awaken more than just the sleepers. He nodded towards a heavily armored blast door at the back of the cavern, a door sealed with layers of magnetic locks and biometric scanners. The 1st Brigade knew they could not win the war, so they saved what they could. Not just people, but our rage, our fire, our teeth. Kalen's mind, the mind of an archivist, reeled. He had been so focused on the emotional impact of the memory bomb, on the rediscovery of the soul, that he had never truly considered its original purpose. It wasn't a poem. It was a battle cry. Under Silas's guidance, Kalen, the man who had spent his life redacting history, was now tasked with unleashing it. He placed his hand on a scanner, then the Svalbard crystal into a receptacle. He spoke a passphrase he had deciphered from the crystal's deepest layers, a line from an ancient Terran poet, Rage. Rage against the dying of the light. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a low, powerful thrum began to vibrate through the floor, a sound of immense, dormant power stirring to life. The blast door, 80 years sealed, hissed as its locks disengaged. With a deep groan of tortured metal, it began to slide open. What lay beyond was not a weapons cache. It was a hangar, and in the center of that hangar sat a ship. It was an ugly, brutal thing, an angular beast of scarred, non-reflective plating, built for war, not for beauty. It was pre-imperial, its design principles utterly alien to the sleek, graceful aesthetic of the architects. It was a relic of a time when humanity fought with fury and fire. The vengeance. Silas's voice whispered through the comm. The last of the Earth Defense Fleet's Titan-class assault carriers. The 1st Brigade flew it here in the final hours, loaded with everything they could save. But the ship itself was not the weapon. It was the delivery system. The cavernous hangar was filled with stasis pods, thousands upon thousands of them, stacked in silent, waiting racks. Not refugees, Anya said quietly, her voice stripped of its usual cynicism, replaced by something approaching awe. Soldiers. The Echo Brigade's elite. They weren't killed in the war. They were put to sleep, their memories and combat skills perfectly preserved, waiting for the Heartcry's signal to reawaken. The Vengeance was more than a ship. It was an ark of war. And Kalen had just turned the key. He had thought he was freeing a people. He had, in fact, unleashed an army. As the hangar doors opened, a change began to sweep through the stasis pods. The soft blue light of hibernation shifted to a diagnostic amber. One by one, the pods began to hiss, the cryo-fluid draining away, the occupants stirring within. These were not the broken, confused refugees he had led from the upper city. These figures emerging from their 80-year slumber were hard-bodied and clear-eyed. They moved with a purpose and a discipline that was terrifying to behold. Their calm locks had been surgically removed before they were put into stasis. Their emotions were not a new, overwhelming flood. They were honed, sharpened weapons. A man with a face like a granite cliff and a general's insignia tattooed on his neck was the first to fully emerge. He took one look at Kalen, then at Silas on the monitor, and his expression hardened. He didn't ask who they were or what had happened. His first words were a simple, brutal question. Status report. What's our target? Kalen felt a chasm open at his feet, far deeper and more terrifying than the one the hive was built in. He had wanted to give his people back their hearts, but the heart he had just reawakened was not that of a poet or a craftsman. It was the heart of a soldier, a heart that had been put to sleep in the midst of a losing war, a heart that beat with a single, unifying rhythm vengeance. The general, whose name was Marcus Thorne, listened to Silas's explanation with an unnerving calm. He processed 80 years of history as if it were a battlefield briefing. When Silas finished, Thorne turned his cold, hard gaze on Kalen and his small, trembling flock. "They're soft," Thorne said. A simple, damning assessment. He looked at Alara, at Jax, at the others, and saw only weakness, 80 years of engineered docility. "The war isn't over," Thorne declared, his voice ringing with an authority that dwarfed Silas's weary wisdom. "It was just paused, and now it resumes." He turned to his awakening soldiers, who were already donning combat armor and checking weapons with practiced ease. "Our mission is unchanged. We will not liberate Cygnus X1. We will not negotiate with the architects. We will break their perfect city. We will tear their peace apart, piece by piece, until they remember the cost of caging a human soul." He looked back at Kalen. "You were the key, archivist. Now be the scribe. Record what happens when a ghost learns how to fight back." The low thrum of the Vengeance's primary reactor began to build, a sound not of hope, but of impending, glorious, and terrible destruction. Kalen had wanted to teach his people how to feel. He was about to get a lesson in what happened when the only feeling left was rage. The war when it came, was not a glorious symphony of rebellion. It was a discordant shriek of metal on metal, of a past clawing its way into a sterile present. General Thorn was a man unstuck in time, an artist whose only medium was violence. He saw the 80 years of the Great Tranquility not as a period of history, but as a tactical pause, a long, deep breath before a final, world-shattering scream. He did not see the people of Cygnus X1 as his kin, as lost brethren to be saved. He saw them as a resource, a battlefield, and, ultimately, as acceptable losses. The vengeance did not rise from the chasm like a herald of freedom. It tore its way out, its ancient plasma engines melting anew, raw wound in the underbelly of the city. Thorn's strategy was not one of liberation, but of decapitation. Using Kalen's knowledge of the city's deep infrastructure and Silas's real-time data feeds, he targeted not the architects themselves, but the systems that maintained their perfect peace. The first strike hit the central atmospheric processors. Suddenly, the clean, recycled air of the upper city became thick, humid, and tasted of the industrial smog from the hive. The weather, for the first time in a century, was no longer a matter of civic planning. It became unpredictable. It rained. The second strike, a series of precise electromagnetic pulses, disabled the citywide Calm Lock network. It was a mercy and a cruelty in equal measure. For the millions of Uppersiders still reeling from the initials and faint ripples of the heart cry, this was a tsunami. The dam of placid contentment didn't crack. It exploded. 80 years of suppressed emotion, grief, rage, joy, terror, love unleashed itself upon a population utterly unequipped to handle it. The perfect city descended into a beautiful, terrifying madness. People wept openly in the pristine plazas, fought with savage, unrestrained fury over transport pods, or simply stood frozen, catatonic, overwhelmed by the sheer, deafening noise of their own souls. Kalen watched it all from the Vengeance's bridge, a ghost at his own haunting. This was not the awakening he had envisioned. He had wanted to give his people a choice, to return the tools of their own humanity. Thorn had taken those tools and forged them into weapons. He saw Ilara standing near the main view screen, her face a mask of horror as she watched the city of her birth tear itself apart. The serene archivist was gone forever, replaced by a woman bearing witness to the apocalypse she had helped unleash. "This is not a war," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's a slaughter." Thorn, who stood like a statue at the center of the bridge, overheard her. He turned, his eyes as cold and empty as the void between stars. "Every war is a slaughter," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The only difference is who is holding the knife. For 80 years, we have been the ones on the altar. The architects taught us that peace is the absence of struggle. I am here to teach them that true peace is the absence of an enemy." His logic was as brutal and flawless as the architects' own. He was the dark mirror of their perfection, an engine of destruction as absolute as their engine of control. The architects responded not with panic, but with cold, calculated precision. Their crystalline ships, things of impossible geometry and silent grace, descended from high orbit, but they didn't engage the Vengeance. They ignored it. Their targets were the pockets of greatest emotional chaos on the city's surface, where riots raged. A shimmering, golden field would descend, and every living thing within it would simply cease. No explosion, no screams, just a sudden, absolute silence. They were pruning their garden, excising the diseased blooms with surgical efficiency. Thorn laughed, a harsh, grating sound that was utterly devoid of humor. They still don't understand. He growled. They think they're fighting a fire. They don't realize we are the accelerant. He gave a new set of commands. The Vengeance launched thousands of small, spider-like drones. They were not weapons. They were broadcasters. They swarmed through the city's transit tubes and ventilation shafts, carrying not explosives, but the Svalbard crystal's raw, unfiltered data. They began to play the memory bomb in its entirety, the war, the fire, the grief, the defiance on every public view screen, through every comm speaker, directly into the city's neural data stream. It was an act of profound psychological warfare. He was not just breaking their peace. He was force-feeding them the memory of why that peace was a lie. He was turning every citizen into a soldier in his war, whether they wanted to be or not. Kalen finally broke. He ran to the bridge's command console, where Thorn stood directing the symphony of destruction. "Stop," Kalen screamed, his voice raw. "These are our people. You're turning them into monsters to fight a monster." Thorn didn't even look at him. "We were always monsters," he said calmly. "They just made us forget the shape of our claws. I am simply reminding them." He was about to issue another command when Ilara stepped between them. She held no weapon, only the data slate she had carried with her from the mausoleum. "You're both wrong," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound, unshakable authority that made even Thorn pause. She looked at him. "You think this is vengeance, but it's just suicide. You will break this city, and the architects will simply erase what's left and start again. You're not fighting their ideology. You're just proving their point that we are too chaotic to be allowed to exist." Then she turned to Kalen. "And you," she said, her voice softening slightly. "You think freedom is a gift, but you cannot give someone their soul back and not expect it to be angry. You opened the cage, but you never thought about what the bird would do once it was free." She turned her gaze to the view screen, to the burning city and the silent, golden fields of erasure. "This is our fault, and we have to be the ones to end it." She held up the data slate. "You both think in terms of war, of weapons and targets. But the architect's greatest strength is also their greatest weakness, their logic. They cannot comprehend a paradox. And we, General, are the ultimate paradox. We are a species that will burn the world to save it." She explained her plan, and it was a plan born not of a soldier's strategy or an archivist's knowledge, but of a cartographer's understanding of the human heart. It was insane. It was suicidal. And it was the only thing that might work. They would not fight the architects. They would not run. They would surrender, not to the architects, but to themselves. Under her direction, with Silas rerouting the hive's remaining power, they created a new broadcast, a new frequency. It was not the heart cry's call to awaken. It was a fusion of the Svalbard crystal's raw emotional data and the live, chaotic, screaming feed from the city's millions of newly awakened souls. It was a signal composed of every facet of the human experience, the love and the hate, the despair and the hope, the grief and the joy, all woven together into a single, overwhelming, paradoxical wave of pure, illogical, beautiful being. And they broadcast it everywhere, through the Vengeance's systems, through Thorn's drones, directly at the Architect fleet. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The crystalline ships, beings of pure, perfect logic, were struck by a force their systems could not compute. Imagine trying to explain the color blue to a creature that can only perceive math. The signal was a logical impossibility, a cacophony of contradictions. Their golden erasure fields flickered and died. Their perfect geometric forms began to distort, to waver, as if the universe itself was rejecting their presence. They were not being destroyed by a weapon. They were being undone by a feeling. On the Vengeance's bridge, a silence fell. The ships of the architects did not explode. They simply faded, like a dream upon waking, their light folding in on itself until they were gone, retreating from a reality that no longer made sense to them. The war was over. In the quiet that followed, Thorn looked at the city below. No longer a battlefield, but a garden of beautiful, terrible chaos. His soldiers stood motionless, their weapons lowered, listening to the cries and laughter and screams rising from their broken home. The war they had slept for was over, but the world they had woken up to was not one they understood. Thorn turned to Ilara, his face, for the first time, showing not the cold certainty of a general, but the lost confusion of a man out of time. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice a whisper. Ilara looked at Kalen, and for the first time since they had fled the mausoleum, she smiled. It was a small, weary, but triumphant smile. "We did what they never could," she said. "We chose." The future of Cygnus X1 was uncertain. It would be a future of struggle, of pain, of rebuilding not just a city, but the very meaning of their existence. It would be loud and messy and imperfect, but it would be theirs. Kalen, the archivist, walked to the view screen and looked down at the world he had both broken and saved. He had started this by unearthing a seed of the past. Now, standing beside the woman who had taught him the language of the present, he was finally ready to face the future. The great tranquility was dead. The long, silent peace was over. Humanity was awake, and the universe would never be quiet again.